Hello and welcome to this new blog post. Today we're going to talk about one of the most important ingredients of guaranteeing success of a data warehousing project. This is a do not pass go situation, right? Don't have one of these, do not pass go. It's that important. And of course we're talking about methodology. And I mean the methodology that is going to be used during the project. I see so many projects that have failed, and when I asked, well, what methodology were you using? The answer is very often agile, or sometimes even no specific methodology at all. Really, I get those answers. And if you ask around, just ask around on LinkedIn, I think you'll find that you'll get those answers as well, right? So let me say this right here, right now. If you're not using a data warehousing specific methodology, then your chances of success are very severely compromised. It's not that a methodology will guarantee your success, far from it, but not using a methodology, that's just asking for trouble, right? Now, I have a massive amount of experience with IT development methodologies in general because I started with my first methodology in 1982 called Pride and BI methodology specifically. The first methodology for BI that I was exposed to was the Metaphor Computer System methodology in 1993. I then wrote the BI methodology for SAS Australia in 1995. I wrote the High Star Warehouse methodology for Hitachi Data Systems in 1996. I used the PricewaterhouseCoopers methodology for BI in 1998, which was written by a good friend of mine. I used the Prism data warehousing methodology in 1999 to 2000 when I was a professional services manager at Ardent. And I used the Sybase systems integration methodology from 2001 to 2005. So have quite a bit of experience with BI methodologies. And as far as I know, I don't know anybody else who has had exposure and used as many of the leading data warehousing methodologies as I have. If you have, if there is someone out there, I'd be interested to meet you. So I know data warehousing methodologies, right? I know good and I know bad, and I know the difference between the two, okay? So we have developed our own methodology that we have adapted to be tightly linked to our products. And our methodology is a result of the many years of work that I've been involved in over these last 21 years, 23 years. We have produced a 1-hour video about our methodology, and you can download the presentation slides from the link that's there and available. Now, naturally, I'm not going to repeat our methodology presentation in this blog post, right? You can go and hear what we have to offer whenever you like. It's up there on YouTube. In this blog post, I'm going to give you 4 key questions to ask about the methodology you are using and whether you've developed it yourself or whether you're using one from a vendor. Whatever you're using, and if it's a vendor one, if your vendor can answer these questions off the top of their head sensibly, you should be asking some harder questions, right? So question number one. Number one question you should be asking of a data warehousing methodology is this a waterfall methodology? And what do I mean by that? Now, most people understand what a waterfall methodology is, but just in case you don't, I'll go through it very briefly. This slide that's in the blog post is a slide that's the most important slide in our whole sales kit. And it shows the way in which our software enables us to alter the way we deliver projects. And just in the blog post, click on the image to get the full size, right? So what you'll see in that image is a traditional approach to building a data warehouse is to follow a waterfall methodology of some sort. The phases run something similar to there's requirements, there's data model design, there's data mapping, there's ETL design and build, there's applications build, testing, move to production, right? So you have this kind of stepping from each phase, and this is why it's called waterfall, because what comes out of one phase goes into the next phase, comes out of that phase, goes into the next phase, just in case you're not familiar with that term, right? Now, once the applications have begun, once the applications building has begun, and new ideas are forthcoming about what would be really valuable, those ideas go into release 2.0, which we all know may or may not ever be implemented, right? Now, typically the phases have some sort of overlap. The greater the overlap, the greater the risk of the project being unsuccessful. In an ideal world, of course, and you have unlimited time and unlimited money, you would not overlap the phases to reduce the risk. But we don't live in an ideal world, not by a long shot, right? We have budgetary and time constraints. Now, the biggest problem with this style of data warehouse implementation is that you do not get to start building applications, and you do not get a populated data model until after you have coded a significant portion of the ETL in your ETL tool. You don't get the access to the data until after you've coded some relatively significant portion of ETL. Now, we have always tried to build prototypes and reduce the risk, but back in the 90s, when we were dealing with complex ETL in large volumes, we could not build prototypes in anything more robust than Microsoft Access. If you're still building prototypes in Microsoft Access, that should be ringing alarm bells. These were tiny and simple prototypes that very often had significant flaws in them. We did our best, but often our best was fraught with problems. Those were tough days to get data models as good as we could before sitting down and coding the ETL in some vendor tool like we used to do when I was a professional services manager at Arden. Now, when I wrote my list of features that an ETL tool needed, when I wanted to build my own ETL tool, two of them were typeless and mappingless. Now, by this, I meant that the ETL tool itself should have no idea of the data types involved, so that there cannot be a problem with data type mismatches. Data type mismatches were the bane of our ETL developers at Arden. The slightest mismatch would generate a message and we'd have to go fix it. There'd be thousands of these. It also meant that the ETL tool itself should not know what mappings exist, right? The ETL tool should discover the mappings that are needed at runtime. And I propose that there be no dictionary where the mappings were defined or where the source and target tables should be defined. No dictionary was what I proposed in this tool. Now, I propose that the ETL engine should be told which source and which target, and it was to use at the time of running, at runtime, and that it should open the source, open the target, discover the column names between them, build a map according to the column names, and then process the data based on the column names. And I propose that the dictionary should be minimalist and that most data should be stored in the database catalog itself and read using ADVC to give greater transportability. That's all the things I proposed in this tool when I wrote down my list of requirements in 2001. Now, by doing this, the processing could be abstracted to one program per type of processing, and that one program could perform all the processing for that type of processing for all the mappings. Naturally, the ideal place to store the sources and targets was inside the database as a view and not in some external catalog that would be used to define the processing. Now, that was all implemented in the CTL C++ engine. It was very successful, worked really well. Now, this had the added benefit, having said all that, why did I bother doing all that, right? This had the added benefit that it became possible to implement the prototypes to a full scale before migrating the CTL ETL to the ETL vendor tool of choice, right? We built full scale prototypes and we could get the applications build started way earlier than we could get it started in any other way. Because CTL enabled us to build the prototype to full scale, we were able to collapse the waterfall methodology. So you had this waterfall methodology. We collapsed that waterfall methodology so that model design, data mapping, and ETL design and build all happen simultaneously. This collapses the timeline of the project, it drastically increases productivity, and it reduces risk. That's where we get at least 50% from. Further, because the application's build can be started much earlier, feedback from the application's build can then be fed back into the data model design process. I mean, we build applications 2 months before we're finished the end of data model design, right? We start building applications very, very early in the process. Now, if the client insists on using an already installed vendor ETL tool, as they may have an installed tool and may have a standard, then the CTL to ETL tool migration happens at the very end of our development projects. And we have tools and methods of doing that quickly and easily with a good QA process to compare the two ETL streams. So the very first question you should ask of your methodology is this. Is it a waterfall methodology? Do you have to go through these steps? Do you have to build your ETL in your ETL vendor tool before you get some decent amount of data in your test database? And if you're doing that, that is a major contributor to risk because of the time that it takes. It's not appropriate and it's not necessary today. You do not have to do that. You can use CTL for free today to collapse the timeline of your project, right? So compare the diagram of what we use and compare the diagram to what you do and make up your own mind about the contribution to risk for your project, right? Question two that you should be asking. Do you have to spend major dollars before you are sure of what you will get? Right? Very simple question. Now, I have bid for and won the largest data warehousing tender of the year in my country twice, right? Twice, not just once. Once for the Australian Customs Service in 97 and the second time for Telstra in 98, the ex-government telco. And I have also won many millions of dollars of BI business in other tender responses. Writing a tender, I'm your man, right? I know how to write BI tenders. I read a lot of BI tenders. Now, one thing that I never particularly agreed with in the tender process is how the customer has to make a decision and back that up with a major amount of money before they know what it is they're going to get, right? Now, of course, that's okay. When you're selling hardware or software, where you can read the specifications and the manuals and be sure of what you're getting, and you can sue or you can not pay if the delivered product doesn't match the specs, that's okay. Tender process is good. But building a data warehouse is very different. And as Bill Inman famously said in the 90s, you don't really know what you want from your data warehouse until after it is built and you start using it. That was a perceived wisdom in 93, 94. We build this thing and then we figure out what we're going to use it for, right? It's not, let's have requirements, design, etc., because we know what we want. In most cases, in the early 90s, we had no idea what the business really wanted out of this thing, right? Now, this absolutely reflected my experience as well in the early 90s. My first data warehouse business requirement was I want to be able to ask any question I think of. I do not know what the questions will be, and I want the answer before I forget why the hell I asked the question in the first place. Right? That's actually what the man said. Right? Now, I mean, how do you tender for a system like that? Right? You can't write a tender document for a system like that. So too often companies buy their data warehouses via a tender process where they have to make a decision and a major financial commitment before they know what it is they're going to get for their money. Now sure, they have business processes to go through, but it's a business process that increases the risk of failure far more than it reduces the risk of failure. Tendering for projects is supposed to reduce risk and costs by getting the vendors to bang their heads against each other over features, functions and prices. And in areas where the delivery is well defined, I agree, it does this, right? You want to buy hardware, you want to buy software, put it to tender, get the vendors to beat their heads together on price, great, okay? But to build your data warehouse, you should get the almost finished product before you put down the big dollars, pounds, euros, whatever currency it is that you're using. If your vendor is wanting to lock you into spending the big dollars and making a large financial commitment before you know what you're going to get, this should be ringing alarm bells very, very loudly in your ears, right? Specifically, you should be able to have a reasonable sized prototype built before you put down your money for your production hardware or software. And that includes the ETL tools, which are quite pricey, right? A copy of DataStage or Informatica is not like it used to be. They're quite pricey, those tools. Now, this all comes back to the ability to prototype your data warehouse before you have to put the big money down. And that means prototype ETL, or ETL that is free until you're almost finished, right? Now, any ETL that locks you in, the DataStage and Informatica are going to lock you into that ETL. So that's not free. If they say, well, we'll give you the license for free, we won't charge you for the license until we get to the end. Well, if you build your ETL subsystem, you're locked in. You're going to have to go with them, and they're going to sting you on the price, right? Now, we make CTL free for those people who sign a contract saying that they will not deploy the ETL into production. And it's our way of giving you the try and buy. So you can use CTL for free, build your prototype warehouse, then you can migrate to something else if you want, right? And if you do that, and if you're new to this and you don't have a vendor ETL tool, then you can make the ETL tool vendors bid. You can get DataStage and Informatica bang their heads together on price at the end of the project when you've still got a choice, right? Where you can still go either way, right? Now, if our clients also use BI for all, then they can inspect the data models to a great extent before buying. For example, we have 7 hours of video that takes our prospects through the data models end to end, so they can understand what it is they're buying before they have to spend any money. And further, even after the 7 hours of video, and they put down some money and say, okay, well, we want to license these data models, we now license BI for all models on an annual basis. We used to only sell them. In the SKA days, it was purchase, right? Now, if you do not like what you're getting, then you don't pay the license fee, you decommission the data warehouse in favor of whatever else it is you want to implement. 1 year, you have to pay your first year's license, and if you don't like it at the end of the first year, you just don't pay again. So the worst you're going to do is have a 1-year license where you go through the development process, get to the end and go, oh, we don't really like that, we want to do something different. And the amount of money you'll have spent on the BI for all license is nominal, and the same with CTL. CTL, you'll probably buy 2-3 licenses, 800 euros a piece. So for our tools and technology to build your data warehouse in a 3 to 6 month project and try it and see if it works, you're going to be spending 8,000-9,000 euros on us, right? Which is a rounding error given the services and the time and the effort that's going to be costed by the services. Okay, but the fact remains, if your vendor is driving you to spend the big dollars before you know what you are getting, this should be ringing alarm bells. Your vendor should explain to you they are free to stop. Your vendor should explain to you how they are free to stop at any time until the prototype is signed off as being what is designed and needs to be productionized in the chosen production tool. So your vendor should be very open to say, yeah, you can stop this process, right? Now, the vendors who say we need an army of programmers and that's why you shouldn't stop your data warehouse project, that should also ring alarm bells, because you shouldn't need more than half a dozen people to build even a very decent sized data warehouse nowadays, right? Now, of course, for your part, you must understand that prototypes are not production ready systems. And I've had that conversation a lot in the last 30 years. And you need to have the patience to give your IT people the time to turn prototypes into production systems. Too often, and really too often, I see business people put pressure on IT people to productionize a prototype rather than to make sure the job is done properly. So your number 2 question is, do I have to put the big money down before I know what it is I'm getting, right? The next big question you should be asking of your methodology is number 3, what is the level of transparency in progress, right? I'm the customer, you're the vendor, you're doing this job for me, I'm paying you. What's the level of transparency in progress as you're moving along through this project? Now, it never ceases to amaze me, really, it never ceases to amaze me how vendors get away with the lack of transparency of their project work that they do. Really, as a vendor, I've been a vendor, and as a vendor in many of my projects, I went out of my way to make sure that progress was as transparent as possible, warts and all. This makes for more successful projects. Hiding problems from your client might be good in the short term, but it is bad for business in the longer term. To give you an example of the level of transparency you should be asking for, if not demanding, this is how we make transparency possible. So think about what you do. You know what you do. We don't. Well, I'll explain what we do to make transparency in progress very, very transparent, very highly transparent. Now, the CTL workbooks, the things we use to document everything, are all able to be loaded into our dictionary. We are the only people to have an end-to-end BI development dictionary that I know about. If you've got one, I'd like to hear from you, right? Where the product does not make its metadata readily available, like the reporting tools, we have proxy documentation that allows us to enter the metadata about the tools into our dictionary. We do the same for things like stored procedures. As the project progresses, spreadsheets are versioned and loaded so that the old versions can be queried. This means there is no temptation to fiddle the numbers from week to week in reporting cycles because last week's data is still in the dictionary, right? Fiddling the numbers will be exposed quickly and easily, so that won't be done because, it's just a no-brainer. You'll get caught, right? The dictionary is open and easy to query. We provide SQL report services reports for all the information in the dictionary. If you would like another query tool to report on the dictionary, recreate the reports in any tool you would like. Our tools record everything from business requirements, project objectives, all the way through to every field in the data warehouse. Every field of every report, every single piece of ETL, everything is in our dictionary. I don't know that there's anything missing from our dictionary. Now, if you use it and you find something missing from our dictionary, give us a call or drop us an email because it's really easy to add new stuff to the dictionary. Now, during the development of ETL, we track the progress of each mapping through the development process. So creating, you have various levels that each mapping needs to go through. Now, creating the weekly status report or progress report is a little more than running the reports off from our dictionary and presenting them to the project management group that reviews such projects. There is simply no way, on our projects, there's no way for a project manager to hide problems when our methodology is married to our tools. Can't be done, right? The project manager can't hide the problems on our projects by design, right? We can give counts of fields mapped, percentage progress, level of testing that the mappings have been through, everything. Our clients find our level of transparency better than any other vendors that they deal with. And you might like that. I'd suggest it's really important. We even have our project planning worksheets in the CTL tool if you wish to use those instead of a normal project management tool. So, for example, most people use Microsoft Project for their development projects. But if you don't want to use Microsoft Project, you just want a basic, enter here project planning tool. We don't build the dependencies or anything else like that. What you put into the workbook is what comes out, right? It's nothing special about it, except that data that you put into the workbook is in the database and can be reported on, right? Now, if your vendor solution does not have full transparency in reporting, if you have to take the vendor's word for progress, that should ring alarm bells in your ears, right? Number 4, fourth big question. Very few people ask this question. But fourth big question about your methodology and how it's implemented and what it does is, how does the methodology reduce communication paths? How does it minimize the number of communication paths necessary to take, right? Now, not many people think about this, but software development is all about communication paths, right? How many are there? And why? It's about how many are there and how is information communicated along these communication paths. Now, the more communication paths you have and the less fixed the format of the communication, the higher the risk, right? The higher the chance of failure. Communication paths have been the study of software development since Frederick P. Brooks wrote The Mythical Man Month back in the 70s, a book that I read in 1982. So again, let me explain how we address this issue so that you can compare it with your situation, right? Our workbooks allow the collapse of the tasks for data modeling, data mapping, ETL design, and build to all occur at the same time in the same tool, that tool being an Excel spreadsheet. There is no separate exercise of, I'm going to design a data model on paper and in my head, and I'm going to put that in a data modeling tool, like Irwin, Power Designer, all these great data modeling tools that are out there. There's no separate exercise of documenting the source to target mappings in Word or Excel, and then giving those specifications to a programmer to code it into an ETL tool. No separate exercise for that, right? The data modeler, the ETL designer, and the ETL coder are one and the same person in our projects, right? There is no communication path, needed to anybody else. The data modeler, ETL designer, and ETL coder, one and the same person, no communication path. Versus, in virtually every other project we see, there are at least 3 people involved, because the data modeler, the ETL designer, and the ETL coder are at least 3 different people, and usually you have a number of ETL programmers, right? So they're one and the same person, and there's no communication path needed to anybody else. This rather remarkable situation is dependent solely on the ability of the workbook to capture all that information, right? We actually recommend that all data modeling, ETL design, and ETL implementation for the prototype be done by one person per project. One person per project. Now, of course, this is a highly skilled job now. We've taken these skills from 3 different jobs and built a tool that allows one person to do all 3 jobs. So that person has to learn not the tools about how to do this, but the techniques on how to do data modeling, ETL design, and ETL build. So usually this person is previously a data modeler, right? So you can't teach an ETL designer how to design data models, but you can teach a data modeler how to design ETL, right? Now, it's a very high skilled job because of the diversity of skills needed. And this was on our projects, normally my job over the last 12 years. Now, on some projects, clients like to do some of the work to learn, like Brian Ganley on the car phone warehouse video. Brian worked next to me. He built mappings. He worked on the data model, those sorts of things, because he wanted to learn how to do that and apply that back to car phone warehouse. Our general approach to skills transfer is to get the DBA for the project to be the reviewer of all this work. And it is a DBA who has to take the workbooks and physically implement the database. So the database might need a few tweaks over and above what's in the ETL tool. Or the data model designer will design a table, but the database designer will say, well, there's a few tweaks I want to make to this table to implement it in this particular database. Because the data modeler, of course, he's only concerned with the column names and the data types, table names, column names, data types. That's the end of his concern. The DBA will implement that the best way it can be implemented on whatever database is being used, right? So it is a DBA who has to take the workbooks and physically implement the database, but that's only a part-time job in our projects. So the DBA is used to go get answers to the questions from the designer so that the designer does not need to chase answers to questions, and that saves a lot of time. So the DBA becomes a QA person for all this work that the designer's doing. The mechanism for communication is not imprecise text in a Word document or descriptions in an Excel workbook. It is source code in a workbook that can be used by a generator. And that is much more precise and a much more reliable way of communicating what needs to be communicated, source code, because you can tell when it's wrong, right? So compare this to your project. If you are having one person designing a database, another designing ETL, another group coding ETL, then you have numerous communication paths, all of which can have failures along the way and generally will, right? The reduction of the communication paths and the preciseness of communication by using coded workbooks vastly reduces time, effort, and risk when designing and building a data warehouse. Now, this is true whether you use a package model like IBI011 or whether you're going to design a custom model for your company. It's still true that if you collapse all that work down to one person, you reduce the communication paths. Now, one of our clients insisted that they wanted everything that needed to be remembered in the workbooks and in the dictionary, so that as staff turned over, because staff turnover in the UK is ridiculous, as staff turned over, they knew 100% for certain that everything they needed to know was documented in the workbooks. And because this was a very big client, we said, of course, sir, we'll do that for you. Now, compare and contrast this to your situation. Do you have different pieces of code in different places and different tools so that it is possible to forget some component when you're attempting changes? And of course you do. I mean, this is quite normal in companies that do not use our tools, and we see that all the time. So in summary, in this short blog entry, I've presented 4 different specific questions that you should be asking about the methodology you're using to implement and or maintain your data warehouses. They are again, 1. Is it a waterfall methodology? 2. Do you have to spend major dollars before you are sure of what you will get? 3. What is the level of transparency of progress? And 4. How does the methodology reduce communication paths, thereby reducing risk, increasing your probability of success? Now, these are, in my mind, the four most important questions you need to be asking about the methodology that you are using. If your BI vendor or consultants cannot present you with a sensible answer to these questions, you should be hearing alarm bells, right? You should hear alarm bells. The methodology you use to deliver your data warehouse project will be one of the most important factors towards your success. It will not guarantee success, but it will go a long way towards that goal in and of itself. And of course, a bad methodology, or heaven forbid, really, heaven forbid, no methodology, will increase your risk. Now, if you want to review the methodology and approach, if you want me to review the methodology and approach that your vendor is using, I'd be more than willing to provide you a written report for a reasonable consulting fee, right? Now, if you got this far listening to or reading this, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening or reading, and I hope this was useful to you. Thanks very much for reading.